Hello and welcome to our episode Architecting Software Quality Live with Andrey. Today we will be talking about a very interesting topic that has to do with startups and constraints that are existing in those startups when they're trying to develop safety critical systems. Before I introduce my guest today, I'd like to tell you kind of a story in lieu of in a way of introducing the topic of today's talk. I think a couple of months ago, Parasoft has been contacted by a company. It's a startup company. They just created a medical device that they're trying to get through clinical trials, and they're trying to build a case to pass through FDA regulatory approval. Well, they searched online, they found Parasoft. It's like, okay, we do something, we make tools to get you, help you with IC62304 certification. Well, when I asked them what was the reason of contacting us now and not when they started the development, they said, well, we just wanted to develop a prototype. It was something quick and to show the progress. And you know how it is in startup development. We were trying to just go fast, and all of this compliance stuff is just way too much work. So it is a lot of work. But now they are facing interesting challenge from my perspective. And today, I'd like to introduce my guest, Glen Larson, who is actually an expert on this topic. For the past 15 years, he has been focusing on helping small and startup companies get over the hurdles of creating safety critical medical systems. He helps in all aspects, starting from management, technical leadership, architecture, and he also wrote a lot of code and tested a lot of software for those companies. So with that, I'd like to bring him into the studio and say hi. Hi, Glen.
Hey, nice to be here.
I am very happy to have you here on the show. So we talked a lot about medical device development, right? What it entails and what safety critical aspects that you need to document. But before we dive into the details, maybe you can give a quick overview of what are the safety critical practices that you deem important for development of medical device technology.
All right. Developing a medical device, especially something that's got real hazard to the patients or the operators, involves what amounts to a full suite of quality practices that you really should do. I say really should because some people try to use sleight of hand or finesse and get out of some of them. And I have to say that the companies that do the most overt finessing are the people who end up with problems down the line when their product just seems to do odd things at the least appropriate points in time. But the quality practices are generally just good industry practices that you're applying intentionally. You're documenting, and you can show at the end that you did them the way you're going to say you did them. And you got to start at the top down through the design process. Start with good requirements, come up with architectures and designs for the software, have all that stuff reviewed, and then start developing from the bottom up, working on, of course, code, having static analysis, having unit tests, putting all this stuff under configuration management, being able to trace your test protocols back to your requirements. Hey, do a lot of hazard analysis. Get those mitigations, feed them back into your design requirements, and wow, a lot of work needs to be done in order to do it well and to do it right.
Wow, yeah, I agree. I certainly sympathize with that because people who are contacting us, they are not seeing the fact that there's a lot of effort there involved to actually do a non-coding related things, right? So it's
Yeah.
it's all the traceability. But for this, and I see that some of the mature organizations, like I used to work at Medtronic and some of the other ones, they have huge departments that are responsible, right, for setting up quality systems and all of those standards. But from your experience, comparing and contrasting, like big organizations where you also played a role,
Yeah.
and with startups, what do you see different in the startup environment?
Wow. Well, the main difference is that everything that happens in a startup environment is first done under more real pressure. And the second one is that all of the is that everything seems to be a little bit sharper, right? When the upper management tells you you have a
Mhm.
deadline, it's not because you're making a marketing window or a trade show or something like that. It's because they need to get this thing delivered to show to their investors that the company is worth putting more money into. And if you're not delivering, it's difficult for everyone, and sometimes the doors will close on you, and that's not appropriate. You mentioned the big companies uh, with their support staffs. I think that everyone believes that their project is being done under resource constraints. But in a startup company, you'll say, well, where's my IT department to set up a server? I want to do Jenkins. I want to do IBM Doors. And in a startup environment, your IT company did your email and your VPN, and they set up an on-site file server for your design history file and stuff like that. And that's it. You don't have those people. And another one that's really important for software is an SQA function. In a startup environment, you might have a regulatory director who is helping to guide what the clinical trials should be, and their cursory interest in the technical problems doesn't gain much attention or feedback.
Mhm.
So you've got to bring that in on your own. You've got to understand what you've got to do at the end, and not expect to be in a maybe a more typical environment where you're doing the technical work and someone else is coming in to tell you that you need to do things differently, you need to do things better and follow the process that they've established. And it can be an adversarial relationship, which a little bit of that is healthy, but you need to take it upon yourself as a development staff to integrate this stuff into the process that you're working to, so that as you get into the later stages of development, when you're doing the first in man, when you're trying to market your device, that you're not finding out that you did things completely wrong and you're blowing out the schedule and the budget for the company that you're working with.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, it makes sense. So what I'm hearing from you is you kind of need to wear multiple hats as an engineer and be ready to work on one day on setting up Jenkins, and the other day you're writing unit tests, the third day you're
Yeah.
participating in system reviews, right? So
That
that's
that's one of the fun parts
mm,
about working
mm,
at a startup, is that you're not
mm,
a point expert of something,
right.
and a corporate
Hmm.
resource. You're doing a lot of things. I got to say, one day I'm ordering parts from DigiKey to mock up a circuit, and I'm soldering it myself. And the next day I'm saying, oh yeah, here's the SDP and the budget, and you're just all over
Hmm.
the place. And it's refreshing.
It's never
So,
boring, right?
well,
Yeah.
there's never a lack of things to do, and um,
Hmm. Yeah.
if you're bored with what you're doing now, just wait. I guess it's maybe it's like
Hmm.
weather here in Minnesota. What do they say?
Yep.
Just wait. So,
Just
anyways,
wait. Yeah. Yeah. Like last week, what it was 90, and what 2 days ago it was like 60s, and it's quite a bit of
it's going to
drop.
be 90 today. We'll have
Oh, is
fun.
it? Oh, yeah.
So,
All right. So yeah. So getting back to the theme there. So in the startup environment, I think. A long time ago, when I was in school, I asked my professor, how is he able to actually do a lot? And then he said, "Well, Andrey, it's not about what you do; it's about what you don't do."
well,
And I thought that, okay, it's all about which balls you let drop, right?
that's right.
So my question to you is, in the startup environment, what are the practices, the quality practices that you find the most effective one?
Mm, mm. Oh, that's a good question. I mean, it's hard to define. I know there's academics and researchers that
Hmm.
will tell you how many defects you're finding per hour spent, and for example, how slowly you should do a code review in order to maximize the output.
Hmm. Hmm.
What I find is uh, the most important part is to do things intentionally and to plan ahead and to consider where you're trying to go from where you are here, which really isn't a specific quality practice, but the part of that is to set up the quality practices and to be sure that what you're going to be doing now, and it works with what you're going to be doing in the future, works with the goals of the operation you're working with. And one of the things that I found to be really effective in this is to do a very early, what I call a trade study. It's kind of a regular term, but to look around at the technologies that you want to use and the tools that are supported and the ecosystem of the tools and the off-the-shelf software, and pick out tools and software that is going to have a validation strategy. It's one of the things that really that can be overlooked quite easily, is to say, well, we want to pick these tools and they're going to have we'll figure that out later. Or another thing that you can do that is not so welcome in a resource and cash constrained environment is to pick things that are pre-validated, right? I'm going to buy that operating system, and you go into an office and you say, well, I need 50 grand to get this going. Well, that's a lot of money. At least in some environments, that's a lot of money. So you got to look at what you're doing and pick out a tool chain where you think you've got a good story or actual validation for the tools and the off-the-shelf software that you're going to be doing as you go along. Now, as far as actual quality practices, I would suggest first off is starting to look at the mandates that come out of your standards and identify the ones that are going to give you the most benefit and the things that you really need to do early that will avoid rework going on. And I would suggest first off coming up with good coding standard and good design practices. Now, for a safety critical system, that probably in a medical device means an embedded system that's doing something. And there's a lot of good work out there from Flight Avionics or the automotive industry, MISRA and AutoSAR, on what you want to do to write good code. And it depends on the language too. I'm kind of an old C and C++ guy, and I'm really interested in things like Rust going forward, where they've taken off the things that are unsafe in C that you really spend a lot of time looking at, that are very useful in an embedded system, but also are very problematic. Now, one of the things that I would suggest after you have a design practices and coding standard is to get going on the static analysis. This can be very useful early on and stops you from writing bad code that you have to rework later. It also helps when you've got a team to make sure everybody is following the coding standards and people are not doing odd things. Now, I'll admit it can be frustrating when you go through and you have to make all of your initializations to zero be an unsigned zero. I mean, that's not going to trick the compiler up, but it does point out the fact that you're mixing the types of the data types, and will lead you to not do some things over and over again that mean you're going into the code, rewriting stuff on a very fine-grained basis. I mean, in an embedded system, you especially with the way the like ARM processors are done these days, you're working with the hardware very directly from the software. You're using pointers, you're using a lot of bit shifting. This goes for the on-chip peripherals as well as the things you've got hanging off your I2C and SPI buses and whatnot. But getting all that stuff straight in the first place is really useful. It does help to flog out errors too. Then you're moving along well, and you can add in other quality practices later. Let me say that one of the rules of thumb that I've come up with on safety critical software is about 20% of your time is spent actually coding, actually in the lab making things work, and about 80% of the time, by the time you get to the end of the project, was spent on the documentation and the code reviews and writing the protocols and running test protocols. And I'll put the unit tests in that bundle too, because those are you'll end up with probably 3 or 4 times as many lines of code in your unit tests as you have in your actual software, at least if you're doing it well. So Yeah, you've
Hmm.
got to start it,
Or
phase in other practices as you go along. But I would suggest doing that static analysis early, especially if your software lends itself to more problematic programming techniques that C will let
Mhm.
you do and apparently work for you
Mhm.
because they're doing the typecasting and stuff.
I see. Yeah, it's a good suggestion, specifically about like establishing design practices, and code is more reviewable then, right? If you have a common kind of a pattern, right, it will cut down on your code review probably significantly at the back end, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
it's important to have everybody coding along the same way.
Hmm.
A
Hmm.
couple of reasons. One is, first off, is to avoid mistakes and avoid complexity, but also so that people can read each other's code
Hmm.
and that
Yeah.
someone coming into the process or into the project can pick it up and start to work with it. That's,
Hmm.
got to say, good
Yeah.
internal documentation. Maybe that eliminates the most bugs
Hmm.
per minute put on that work. If you can tell people what you're trying to do, then they can pick it up later on. Or
Hmm.
actually, I find when I
Hmm.
go back to code I wrote 2, 3 years ago, it's nice to
Hmm.
have some comments from the guy that wrote that, so I can remember what I was really trying to do.
Yeah. Uh, so you touched on unit testing, which is very interesting. A lot of people hate it. A lot of people are big fan of it. So the community is actually all over the map on this one, to be honest.
Right?
There's also some mentioning of your unit verification requirements in 62304. So,
Absolutely.
right, you kind of don't have a lot of choice. You have to have your story about what you did to comply with that part of 62304, right?
Yeah,
So,
62304 is great. I really like it, and I find a lot of
mhm,
people that do
mhm,
because it's long, it's detailed, it says what you need to
mhm,
do, but it doesn't say how you need to do it.
mhm,
So if you
mhm.
can come up with a good way to approach it, you can justify it in the end. And
Right,
for the unit testing, most people do classic unit testing, right? We're setting
mhm,
up the test harness and having our cases
right.
and
Mhm.
our criteria. So that's really important.
Yeah, and unit testing could be performed. Some people just perform it on a piece of paper, right? They look at the code, they do code review, say we've unit verified that by code review, right? Some that's probably the most unacceptable way of doing unit testing, uh,
Yeah,
right? But then some people just launch the debugger and kind of step through it and check the values of variables, check the stack pointer, make sure that it does what it's supposed to do. But then you have a debugger in the picture, right? So, and then it's very manual. So, what is your kind of thought about testing, unit testing on target versus host and all of that stuff?
I
What's
got to
your
say, I've seen a high correlation between released defects and operations that do not generously unit test their code. I don't know if it's just because it's not unit tested or because it indicates a culture of cutting corners where the code goes out while it does odd things. I mean, in a medical device, unlike a commercial device, I should say a commercial device. I don't mean to be dismissive of it, but if someone says, "Hey, my thermostat did something weird," that's a problem, and they call customer service. You don't want the doctor to say, "Hey, it did something weird." No, that's not acceptable. So I believe in doing good unit tests. I'll say I've been working with Parasoft for about 2 years now, and here's the marketing. Boy, once I get up to like 70 or 80% line of code coverage, I can just extend my stubs and mocks, and I look at some of the modules, and I've got 99, 100% line code coverage. And that last 20%, instead of being onerous, is easy because once you've got a happy day scenario running through the code covering almost everything, getting those last nooks and crannies of the usually of error handling is easy. But it does take a lot of effort to do, and I would suggest, uh, I think you were talking in a recent summit or
Mhm,
something I saw, and the guys
mhm,
were talking about test first. And test first is great as a theory. And what do they say? Theory and practice are the same in theory. I'm a I'm a
Yeah.
unit test later guy, but don't put the unit tests off until you think you've got the product done. You're losing the benefits of having regression tests in place. It's one of the things that regression. It literally means going backwards, and that's what the unit test can do for you. And I've seen that in my own in my own tests. Is I change something, and you think, well, it's not going to have a ripple effect, but it did, and you didn't, and
Mhm.
I didn't anticipate that. So it's like when you think your architecture is stable and most of your code is in place, and you're working on starting to work on fine tuning of the treatment or therapy or whatever the business end of the product is called. That's a good time to start adding the unit tests as you're stabilizing the base. Right,
Mhm.
you work through the support code, the framework, and work up towards the part of the business logic of what the product is actually trying to accomplish. Because most of the
Mhm.
code in a medical device is dealing with identifying failures and mitigating failures, right? It's not
Mhm.
enough to say, well, my communication bus hiccuped a little bit there. You got to look and say, well, how many times? What am I going to do? What do we do with the product? What do we do with the functionality if it happens in operation? That's not good. So most of the code is identifying mistakes and then dealing with them. And on a an electromechanical control system, that's that's that goes on for a long time. But you'll stabilize that a long time before you're finally done tuning the product to do what it needs to actually do.
Yeah, uh, definitely mentality of developing a medical device system and tolerance to failures and glitches and hiccups. It's a whole different ball game where you just like if my Alexa device uh, decides to kind of act up, I just power it off and voila, it
Yeah.
works back, right? But the medical device who is potentially controlling my heart, that would not be a such a
Or
great option.
yeah,
Um,
it's over treating, it's under treating, it's
right.
failed to treat your
Yep.
uh, it,
Mhm.
it's a different ball game. And
Yep. Yep. So yeah, it is. So Glenn, in we're about to wrap up. I have one
okay,
last question for you, which is well, before we wrap up. So you've been in the industry quite a bit, right? And then you
yeah,
see how the industry matures, how it changes, what kind of influencing the decisions to add this technology or that processor or that operating system or maybe that new way of doing things, the build system or language, as you said, Rust may be the new wave
yeah,
of. So what trends do you see in the safety critical development arena?
yeah. I'm seeing a lot more uh, availability of software and tools that are satisfactorily certified for use in a safety critical system, and that's a great trend. Um, it's interesting the way technology has changed I'll say over the years or decades, in that hardware has, of course, gotten much more powerful. And then for a while there, software was falling behind because you had to write everything yourself. And now there's more off the shelf software that's becoming available that's appropriate for using in a medical device without having to go through some sort of onerous validation through testing of the system. And the same thing is going on in tools, where you can get stuff that comes pre-approved, that has some sort of development certification, that makes it a lot easier for a team, and especially a small team, to look and say, yeah, we can use this on the product. This is going to be good, and we're not going to get to the end and be held up because this was not a good choice. That gets back to the trade study thing I was talking to earlier on, and really taking a hard look. There's a temptation in all engineering is to do the next project the way you did the last project, and that might be the wrong choice. Take a fresh look. Look at what's out there. Look at the processors, the tools, the software, development chains and see what's going to work best now, and take a holistic look at it so that you can say the net cost is going to be lowest while achieving a high level of quality and checking all the boxes from your standards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. From my perspective, just kind of contribute here to the discussion. I see a lot more use of open source stack, right? That's maybe we should have a separate discussion on the whole
Yeah.
use and qualification and justification for open source. I see the trend of medical devices to be more connected, so that
Oh,
it's no longer right an isolated thing. So you need to test before you have to test. Okay, here's my system. It's a closed system. It doesn't matter what
yeah.
happens everywhere else. Now it's connected, goes via the Bluetooth. You have to validate the data, right? You have to think
Oh,
about the larger context of usability, right? So
with those extremely connected devices, you end up with a medical device attached to a communication node
mhm,
where you've got SSL talking over Wi-Fi and all the server authentication
mhm,
stuff that goes on, and
mhm.
it's an extremely complicated system. Uh,
Right. Yeah. And
so
now there's a talk about distinguishing the device. So there is this new concept. Well, not many may not be relatively new, but it is emerging as one of the main concepts. There is a software as a medical device, where software makes decisions, it treats it, and basically
yeah,
you rely on the brains of the software and the reliability of that software to give you the right advice, the right treatment. Right. So
yeah.
yeah, that's no longer like set of your capacitors or whatnot that could fail. That's the brains of the operation
It,
could fail.
it,
Right.
it's interesting. I know
Hmm.
I was watching TV, and there's a
Hmm.
new ad on there
Hmm.
for blood sugar glucose monitor, and I
Hmm.
watch this very carefully because they say,
Hmm.
and you can make decisions based on this, which tells me that
Hmm.
they've got a class A device. You're making
Hmm.
the decisions.
Yeah.
What you
Yep.
want is you want to beep it, and it says, yeah, you can have a half a Twinkie and 3 carrots,
Hmm.
right? You're still the
Yep.
humans are still making the decisions, and taking it
Yeah.
to the next level would be impressive.
Hmm. Yeah. All right. So we had a really good talk, lots of
Yeah.
interesting information. Before we wrap up, I'd like to give you, Glenn, an opportunity to kind of talk a little bit about yourself, maybe highlight your company, which is Kaiju Technologies, and then kind of tell people when and how they can contact you and for what purpose.
Yeah. Well, I'm Glen Larson. I have a consulting company. It's Kaiju Technologies, and you can find me on the web at www.kaijutechnologies.com. And I like to think that stomping out software problems with a little plasma breath incineration is what makes us different. So, but yeah, work in medical devices. I've worked with companies all over the United States, and uh, drop me a note. You can also find me on LinkedIn, of course, and open to what people might
Mhm.
have to ask.
Yeah, I have to say that I was impressed with your acronym and embedded systems when we first met a couple of years ago. So, um, and also I'll put your credentials and your information in the comments for this video. So whoever wants to contact you won't have to travel far. They'll have to
Okay,
click on the link on this video. So
great.
with that, thank you everybody who watched the video. Thank you, Glenn, for being a great speaker today. I really appreciate everything you
Oh, thank
said.
you.
And then bye.
All
Uh,
right.
bye.
Take care, Andrey.